Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world, one book at a time. Today, we're looking at a system that's absolutely fundamental, the system of national identity. And this book helps us understand why the stories we tell after a war are just as important and maybe even more powerful than the war itself.
All right, to get a feel for this, we have to go way back. We're talking 17th century New England during a brutal conflict called King Philip's War. And check this out. This kind of crude drawing you see here, that's it. It's the only visual we have of the actual fighting from that time. It tells us almost nothing, which means we're forced to rely on the words, the stories that were written down.
And this right here is the absolute core of the whole thing. The physical acts of war immediately kick off acts of narration. Think about that for a second. The fighting and the storytelling aren't separate events. They're two sides of the same coin, both working to draw boundaries, not just on a map, but between people.
So, our guide for this journey is Jill Lepore's incredible book, The Name of War. It's a deep dive into how this conflict didn't just carve up the land. It actually started to forge the very beginnings of an American identity. And it did it all through the power of storytelling.
And let's be clear, this war was absolutely horrific. It just explodes onto the scene in June of 1675, and in a little over a year, the entire region is just engulfed in violence. The level of suffering for everyone involved, both the English settlers and the native Algonquian peoples, it's almost impossible to fully grasp.
I mean, just look at this number. To put it into perspective, this was, proportionally, the deadliest war in American history. More than half of all the English towns in New England were just gone. The physical destruction was staggering. But as we're about to see, the fight over what it all meant, well, that was just getting started. And that fight begins with the name itself. What do you even call this thing? The colonists called it King Philip's War. See what they did there? They framed the Wampanoag leader, Metacom, as some kind of foreign enemy king. But today, you might hear it called Metacom's Rebellion. Totally different vibe, right? That name reframes him as a resistor. The name itself is the first battleground, and it shows you who's holding the power to define history.
Right, so this leads us straight to the big idea. This is where the physical wounds of war collide with the words used to describe them.
Lepore gives us this completely new way to think about war. Yeah, of course, it's a fight over land and resources. We get that. But she argues it's also a contest for meaning. And that contest is every bit as fierce. The struggle over who's the hero and who's the villain, who's civilized and who's savage, that's fought with just as much intensity as any battle.
And this quote it hits so hard. The person left standing doesn't just win the territory. They win the power to define your death. The words they choose, treachery, rebellion, massacre, those words shape how that death and the entire conflict will be remembered for generations to come.
Okay, so how does this actually work? How do you get from a bloody conflict to a national identity? Well, Lepore shows us there's a clear pattern, a kind of formula that repeats itself.
It's basically a three-step process. Simple but incredibly powerful. First, there's the wound, the violence itself. Then comes the word. The winner steps in and tells the story, their version. And finally, that story creates the boundary. It draws a clear line. This is us, and that is them. And just like that, out of the chaos of war, an identity starts to form.
But, and this is crucial, you have to remember that this battle of stories was not a level playing field, not even close. One side had an advantage, a technology that was in its own way as powerful as any musket, the technology of writing.
The English colonists were masters at weaponizing literacy. I mean, look at this. On the official seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they literally put the words, "Come over and help us," into the mouth of a Native American. They decided what he was saying, and the belief at the time was clear. If you can write, you're civil. If you can't, you're savage. That boundary was drawn long before the war even began.
So this brings us to a really powerful question that Lepore poses. If war is a contest for meaning, can it ever be a fair fight when only one side controls the entire machinery of storytelling? From the alphabet itself to the printing press, what chance does the other side really have to make their story heard?
And all of this builds to the book's central metaphor. It's this one powerful idea that explains why a conflict from over 300 years ago still feels so relevant. So, imagine a war creates this massive, painful wound on a society. It's a collective trauma of violence and loss and fear. It's something that needs to heal.
But it doesn't heal.
Instead of getting stitched up, that wound gets rewritten over and over again. Each new generation reinterprets the war, telling new stories about it to serve their own political needs. And in doing so, they keep the conflict and its central questions alive.
And that right there is why this war never really ended, because the pattern, the wound, the word, the boundary, it just keeps repeating throughout history. The same wounds get reopened, and the same vicious words get spoken again, just in different times and different places.
You know, you can literally see this rewritten wound on our landscape today. Here's a photo of the King Philip Inn, located on Metacom Avenue. You have the colonist's name for the man and his own Algonquian name on the same street. It's a perfect snapshot of this ongoing war of words, this unresolved contest for meaning.
So what's the big takeaway here? This reframing helps us see that history isn't just a fixed list of things that happened. It's a story, and who gets to be the narrator changes everything. It shows us that language is a powerful tool for control, and that our national identities are often built right on top of stories told in the aftermath of terrible violence.
And that leaves us with one last question to think about. Once you see this pattern, the wound, the word, the boundary, you start to see it everywhere. It makes you ask, what other histories that we think are completely settled are really just the stories told by the winners?
For the full, long-form deep dive into this book and its ideas, follow the link in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.